Um, Yehuda, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
So, my name is Yehuda Shaul. I'm 42 years old, Jerusalemite, born and raised. eh, Grew up in what you would call the political right in Israel. Did my high school in a settlement in the West Bank. Uh, Graduate high school, joined the military, served from March 2001 to March 2004. I was an infantry combat soldier and a commander. Finished my service in March 2004, and then I was fortunate to be part of a group that started Breaking the Silence, which is an organization today of over 1,500 former combat soldiers who speak out against the occupation. Um, that basically has been my adult life until 2020 when I stepped down and left the organization. And today I'm with a think tank called OFIC, the Israeli Center for Public Affairs, based in Jerusalem, working on Israeli and international policy vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Which means that you'd been obviously looking at the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank, but with great proximity, I imagine, and on both accounts, as a military or former military man and somebody that has been involved in what I think it's worth explaining to our audience, which who might not know or which might not know, that it's one of the most important human rights organizations, Breaking the Silence, in Israel, and has been the source of really a trove of information as to what actually is happening and what are the dynamics of the occupation. When I first met you, which was about a year ago or so, here in Berlin, one of the things that you discussed were the security lapses and the security failures on the 7th of October of 2023. And one of the numbers you gave, which was quite interesting, if not completely surprising, was that during that day, only 450 members of the IDF had been left in the Gaza envelope or around the border. But you also did mention the movement of troops away from the area and so on. So can you give us a bit of a picture of what was the context and what was going on, and what are the things that we found out in the day since then?
Now, I think there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of what happened in October 7, the bubbles that bursted. Um, but obviously, one of the things we hear a lot these days is about, we need to do such and such in order to bring, security to Israel, etc. Um, and and again, we can talk about many things related to this, but I will start with let's have troops guarding our border as opposed to troops outside of our border taking over hilltops in the West Bank. And what I mean by that is that, at least according to reports, um, in October 7 in the morning, there were about 450 combat soldiers on the entire border with Gaza. Now,
What, if I may interrupt you,
just
what is a normal number? What would be normally the expectation for troops there?
no, I don't know what's the normal number because there is no normal number. Yeah, there's a discussion about 3 to 4 battalions on the border, but because it was a Jewish holiday, many people were back home, etc.
Sorry, that means how many people? 3 battalions.
Again, I don't know because it depends whether it's infantry battalions or armored battalions, etc. It's a mixture. But if it would have been infantry battalions, it's around 2,000 soldiers, 2,000 combat soldiers, more or less. But I think the comparison that is important to do in this conversation is not to talk about just the number, yeah, because the comparison to do is between Gaza border versus West Bank. Okay, the talk is about 4 battalions deployed in the Gaza border, around 23 battalions deployed in the West Bank. The comparison to do is between about 450 combat soldiers on that morning versus 650 combat soldiers in Hebron.
Just in Hebron,
Now,
just in the city.
exactly. Hebron is the second largest Palestinian city in the West Bank after East Jerusalem. Together with East Jerusalem, these are the only Palestinian towns that have a settlement in the heart of the city, not only rural settlements around and between the cities. So in Hebron, you have 850 settlers living in the midst of 230,000 Palestinians. Guarding them on a day-to-day basis, you have about 650 combat soldiers. So I think that's a comparison to be done, right? 650 combat soldiers for 850 settlers, 450 combat soldiers for the entire border of Gaza. So I'm not here to try to argue how many soldiers should be in the border of Gaza. I don't know. But what I'm just saying is these are the comparisons we need to see, we need to do in order to see the priorities of the government, priorities of the IDF, priorities of the concept, what is called, of the ruling security paradigm that we had as a country and as a military on October 7th, 6 o'clock in the morning before the massacres began. I think that's the way we need to look at it. And it shows us a very, very clear picture of a military that is heavily invested in maintaining rule over Palestinians in the West Bank, while holding the idea that Hamas is deterred and we are not going to face challenges from within Gaza. There was also reports in the Israeli media that a special forces unit that was supposed to be on alert, kind of like as a secondary backup force for the Gaza border before the holiday, because of an extremist member of Knesset, Tzvi Sukkot, building a sukkah in Hawala, which is a Palestinian suburb of Nablus, was reallocated to be a backup force for the West Bank. So even in terms of the backup forces that are supposed to be, on the radio, attached to what's going on in the Southern Command and in the Gaza border, even that was kind of like shifted and reallocated to accommodate developments in the West Bank. I think this is one thing to keep in mind, but to be honest, I think focusing specifically a number of soldiers on behavior of the IDF on that morning, while very important, I think that misses. This is like the trees, and it misses the entire forest. Yeah,
So
this is not.
Can you
Sorry?
draw a bit of the forest for us?
Yeah. So again, this is not just a military operational failure. Yeah, this is a failure of political strategy, of national security strategy. And many bubbles bursted on October 7th. And one of them is something that is actually discussed a lot in Israel, and especially closer to October 7th, is the very famous statement by, for example, Netanyahu, which was, whoever wants to prevent a Palestinian state needs to support the passage of money from Qatar to the Hamas in Gaza. Or the statement of Bezalel Smotrich, our Minister of Finance today, who said in Israeli TV that Hamas is an asset, the Palestinian Authority is a liability. I know that for people outside that sounds crazy, but that was the policy of the Israeli right, of the Israeli government, which is the idea came from that with the Palestinian Authority, God forbid, if you're going to have negotiations, you might actually end up with an agreement based on two-state paradigm, which is the worst thing that can happen if you're a greater Israel person, right? So it's better that we weaken the Palestinian Authority while strengthening Hamas, because no one will force us to negotiate with a terrorist organization, Hamas, right? So Hamas is an asset, the Palestinian Authority is a liability. And what happened in October 7 is exactly that. You feed Hamas, you strengthen Hamas, you weaken the PA, and it explodes in your face. Another bubble that burst is that the idea that if you base your national security on force alone, you need to perform well 24/7.
To the detriment of political solutions, I suppose, for the Palestinians.
Exactly. Exactly. So you need to perform well 24/7 forever. It's enough one morning you don't perform well, and we saw what happened on October 7th. Another thing, another bubble that bursted within the same concept and line was this idea of managing the conflict. Yeah, we don't really need to solve the conflict with the Palestinians. We can live with it. We can manage. We'll just do a few more things. And apparently, when you manage a conflict, sometimes it explodes on you, like we saw in October 7th. Another bubble that bursted was the story of the Abraham Accords. Yeah, what Netanyahu and Trump one have tried to tell us, which is you can transcend the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can go regional to weaken the Palestinian cause, to take the Palestinian issue off the table. We can go and do peace with, the region, with the UAE, Bahrain, which, by the way, we never had a conflict with them before. We never had war with them, but put that aside. But this idea, that we can marginalize the Palestinian issue by normalizing with Arab countries, take the Palestinian issue off the table. We took the Palestinian issue off the table. Hamas put it back on the table. What an expensive lesson, huh? October
Eliminating,
7th.
I mean, to a large degree, isolating also Palestinian voices during the Abraham Accord, right? It wasn't just the issue, but it's actually that the Palestinians were pretty much eliminated from any kind of participation and place at the sit at the table, as people usually say.
More than that, it was done to marginalize the Palestinian issue. Yeah, to show that we can achieve the benefits of regional normalization without territorial compromise of Palestinians, right? What the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002 told us. You make peace with the Palestinians based on two states, you get normalization with the entire region, and then ultimately with the entire Muslim countries apart from Iran. So that was basically the carrot, the incentive for Israel to pursue two states. What the Abraham Accords try to say is, no. You don't need to solve the problem with the Palestinians. You don't need territorial compromise. You don't need an agreement of two states. You can rip the benefits. You can get the carrots of normalization while continuing occupation and annexation.
Which is, I
And
mean,
the
I think
Pal-
it's an interesting it's an interesting and very strong rejoinder to pretty much every single claim from the Trump administration concerning the Middle East, right? I mean, it is in some sense, I mean, and I think that it very much echoes an intuition that's been with me since the 7th of October, which is that this is not only related to the Abraham Accord, this is almost a direct product of the Abraham Accord. This is somebody banging the table and saying, we're here, and we're going to show you that we're here at whatever cost.
Exactly, especially with the looming threat back then of Saudi normalization without solving the Palestinian issue, right? Like, kind of like reinforcing the Abraham Accords track with the crown jewel, which is the Saudis, even more than the UAE, Bahrain, etc.
I want to
But
go back to the question of the 7th of October. So one of the many reports, I mean, is that there was no presence, no military response, and this is something that Gideon Levy, among others, reported. I mean, well, the reports were really quite extensive, but there was no presence, no response, and no deployment to some of the kibbutzim in the south until 3 p.m. I think in particular Nidos, if I'm not mistaken. Nobody showed up until 3 p.m. That's actually about 10 solid hours or 9 hours. What's the story with this?
to be honest, I don't think I know enough to try to answer in details exactly what happened, where, and when. Yeah, it's probably a combination of many things. Dehumanization and arrogance. These Arabs are not really capable of doing anything serious. Incompetence and spreading across different elements of the IDF. The fact that the command and the control of the regional brigade and the division was in the same base. So when that's under attack, there is no one who actually controls the entire district and understands who goes where. The loss of some communication. There are many, but again, I don't feel that at least I have enough information of what happened at any minute, any place. What was going on there. there is also an element, don't forget, there is an element of the rapid response teams and the kibbutzim, and most of the places, if not all, were not allowed to keep the guns, the rifles they had in their home, because there were a lot of cases of stealing of stealing weapons from the area, and also once the fence was built, that kind of like sophisticated special fence with like the whatever the obstacle beneath ground for tunnels. The kind of like the belief was that this is all gone, and a lot of rifles, at least according to some reports, were taken away from the kibbutzim and given to settlements in the West Bank, etc., to arm them. So, in some cases, I know specifically in Be'eri, where I have a friend who was part of the rapid response team and was murdered by Hamas after about 7.5 hours of fighting until they ran out of bullets. And then Hamas guys got them. It's just, talking about going on for hours fighting without getting any assistance from outside, until you literally run out of bullets. It's just insane.
I must say that from the inside must look insane. From the outside, it absolutely defies belief, right? It beggars belief because I mean, not only, I mean, how much time do you have between Beersheba and Be'eri? I mean, 30 minutes on a chopper.
So, but again, the fact is that that's what happened. I don't feel I have the level of details, to actually tell you it's the combination of X, Y, and Z that made it happen. The fact is that it happened.
What is the Israeli public telling itself about this sort of strange sense of almost liberated zone where these people were left to fight for themselves for 7 hours? I mean, how does the Israeli public see this? It's maybe not a fair question. I mean, you're not the Israeli public, but I mean, you are there and you have your ear to the ground. So
look, from my perspective, this is a complete betrayal. The state had to defend them. The army had to defend them, and it failed. It was a clusterfuck, excuse my French, the military, the IDF, did not do what its mission is, and that is to defend the citizens of Israel. Complete failure. It's not that they get 2 out of 5; they get 0, like 2 out of 10. They get 0 out of 10 with what was going on there. But I brought up Be'eri is because I know that some members of the rapid response team were actually killed on the way to the bunkers to take rifles. You understand? Like the entire structure was not even ready to anything close to this, and we paid what we paid, which is an enormous price, and obviously we see the Israeli retaliation, and civilians in Gaza are paying the price until today, and look, at the end of the day, we will also pay the price for generations to come, because the level of destruction, death and destruction that we are causing now in Gaza, we're sowing the seeds of hatred for generations to come. Yeah, I can promise you that thousands of orphans we are creating in Gaza every day. As this war continues, the number of orphans that are created in Gaza is just growing, and I can promise you these kids are not going to grow to become great lovers of Zion. I'll tell you something, and I hope that you understand and take it in the way I mean it, which is what I really, really fear is that we will miss Hamas. Because the kind of forces that will flourish, that will grow within Gaza as we destroy any remains of normal fabric of society and community, will make Hamas look pacifist compared to the forces that will grow there. This is going towards the ISIS type, if not even worse. Because, if you turn Gaza into a Somalia on steroids, you're going to get a Somalia on steroids.
Let me let me ask you about the Hannibal Directive. It's been widely reported now, and it's been said even by the then Minister of Defense himself that, in fact, the Hannibal Directive was activated. There was a claim by an officer saying that this was not just the Hannibal Directive, but the Hannibal Directive at a massive scale, I believe it was a quote. I wonder if you can first take us back a little bit and explain what the Hannibal Directive is, and I mean, and then what do you think that happened that morning?
So the Hannibal Directive, as even I remember from my service in the Lebanon border, the concept is very simple. If you have a case where the enemy is kidnapping a soldier, a comrade of yours, you should use fire to stop the kidnapping, even at the expense of harming the life of your comrade. Because the idea is that a kidnapped soldier is a strategic victory to the enemy. You can see what happened with Gilad Shalit, the amount of Palestinian prisoners that had to be released as part of the exchange, etc., etc. So
Just
that's
to
the
remind people, the Gilad Shalit story was a soldier that was kidnapped by Hamas,
in
right?
2006, exactly, and over 1,000 prisoners were released, including Yahya Sinwar,
Yeah, yes.
in the exchange, right? Who later became the head of Hamas in Gaza and plotted the October 7 attack, etc. He was the commander. But the here I must say that I was wrong in October 7. I actually thought that after so many people kidnapped, it doesn't make sense to activate the Hannibal Doctrine. Yeah, because let's say you have already 200 Israelis kidnapped. What's the difference between 200, 400? Yeah, it's not a strategic difference. Like, 200 is enough to, right? In terms of Hamas, it's a big enough of achievement. Yeah, the Rubicon was crossed, and I was wrong. And indeed, as you said, we know today that at some point during the day, again, speaking from memory, I think it was around midday, around 12 or so, but again, I don't remember exactly when the Hannibal Directive was given. Um, and and without a doubt, there were many cases where people, Israelis, were killed by our own forces as part of this doctrine. But what I think is important is, I think it's important to make sure that we don't use this in order to downplay the horror of the Hamas massacres in October 7th. Yes, some of the Israelis that were killed by friendly fire, but in any battle, there is friendly fire. And yes, one can criticize the Hannibal Doctrine specifically, and okay, that's fine. But And even if, and I don't say this is the case, but even if the majority of Israelis would have been killed by still, yeah, hundreds of civilians were butchered and massacred by Hamas. So I think this is a very important thing that we shouldn't do. And I think, at least from what I've seen online, too many people are trying to downplay, yeah, the horrors of October 7 by focusing on the Hannibal Doctrine.
I think that what to me the Hannibal Doctrine, the deployment of the Hannibal Doctrine, but then the activation of the Hannibal Directive, but also I think that the manner in which the narrative of the 7th of October and the lies that were said afterwards, I mean, 40 decapitated babies and so on, it's not, in a sense, I mean, most certainly can be used to downplay the attacks by Hamas. And I mean, I certainly, just like you, see that that is actually being done. But I think that in some way, what I see much more of is the story of the Hannibal Directive, basically as another sort of and rather large problem in the Israeli narrative, which once again puts into question or essentially just completely, dismantles the government's narration as to what happened. And part of the problem, I think, with the story of the Hannibal Directive, and we don't know what exactly the extent was, right? I mean, even those who spoke about a very large deployment of the directive, is that it brings into question the entire story of what actually is that happened. Right. So I think that the problem is not it's not downplaying Hamas. The problem is that to some extent the manner in which that entire story was handled by the Israeli government has helped to downplay the Hamas attack, which I find it, pretty egregious.
I think a lot of the things like the 40 decapitated babies, etc., that you're saying, I think there's two. I fully in agreement with you. What Hamas did is bad enough that we don't need to
Right. Yeah. Why
make
do we
up,
need to exaggerate?
and add more, fiction to the facts. Um, but also, I would say two things here. I think some people did it purposely in order to play up in
Right.
kind of like this,
Yeah.
barbaric forces of Hamas, right? The forces of light against the barbarism, etc. But I also think that some of them didn't do it by purpose. Some of them, from my experience, and in many other cases, we know that soldiers who go through a very extreme trauma don't necessarily, in their memory, are not necessarily 100% accurate to what actually happens. You know, Specifically, I remember a case from a war in Gaza from Caslet, 2009, 2010, 2008, 2009, sorry, where a soldier was sure that he saw a mother and a child being killed by a sharpshooter from his unit, and he knew the mother and child from before. But actually, the person who was killed in those shots is a nephew or cousin of the mother that was walking near them. Yeah. So they were walking together, and he saw from the window from far away falling, and yeah. So in his memory, this is how it is, and we actually had to do an investigation together with Amirats from Haaretz that took us almost a year, slowly to shave and cross-check and verify things and shave parts of the memory of the different people who saw the incident from different angles, yeah, until we were sure and we were able to say the shooting, the killing happened, but actually it was someone else who was killed. So I think I've seen many cases in the past where when people experience or go through, witness a serious trauma, memory doesn't always, stick 100% factual. So I believe that some people, yeah, I'm not saying all, I'm not definitely not, government offices, etc., that were very busy and in PR stunts sometimes. But some of the people who said this was not something deliberate. It's just human nature when we go through a horrendous trauma like this.
Do you have the sense that the cases that have been now reported of the IDF killing hostages, most of them explained by mistake or as mistakes, have anything to do with directives such as the Hannibal Directive?
Again, to be honest, I don't feel that I have yet clear enough evidence to exactly what happened in every kibbutz, etc. But we, at least the talk is, in the media here, is that there are a few cases where that was the case, and that shouldn't be confused with cases inside Gaza of hostages being killed. Right, there was the horror example of the hostages that were killed by our own troops in the north of Gaza after they were freed. And that is just because of very extreme permissive rules of engagement during the war. Yeah.
Can you talk a
Um,
bit about that?
one of the major problems with the way we fight the war in Gaza is the doctrines the IDF uses in Gaza, um, in the premises of how we fight in Gaza, even before October 7th, and it just got worse, is that in order to minimize to close to zero, if not to zero, the risk on our troops, we use massive amount of force in one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So here comes the question. If in order to get to zero risk to our troops at all cost, you need to use firepower as if you're in an old school conventional battlefield, but you're fighting in an area which is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So how do you square that circle, right? You want to fight as if you're in the middle of the desert in Sinai 73 facing the Egyptian army, but you're actually in the middle of Gaza City, right? So, and the answer the IDF gave to that was leaflets. We take an entire urban center, we drop leaflets. Sounds familiar to these days, right? We ask civilians to leave, we give them a deadline, and once the deadline has passed, from our perspective, anyone who stays is a fair, legitimate target. So this is something that comes from most, if not all soldiers, almost all soldiers who served in Gaza in this war and in the wars before, from 2009 onwards, is if in the West Bank, in order to shoot to kill someone, in order for someone to become a legitimate target, you need to have what we call means, intentions, and capacity. Means meaning be armed, show intentions to harm me, and capacity to exercise it. In Gaza, you don't have means, intentions, and capacity. Deadline has passed. You're not a little boy or an old lady. Deadline has passed. Boom. You don't need to be armed. You don't need to pose a threat. The fact that you're there, you're a legitimate target. And that means before you go in, the Air Force will bomb the hell out of the place to quote unquote soften the targets, and artillery will fire in, and the engineers will open the way as if you're in a proper war, and tanks will, all over, and the mortars will fire, and kind of like the infantry is there to collect the remains of the enemy, so to speak, yeah? Just like in a conventional old school warfare. But the issue is that you're doing this in a city. And this is one of the reasons to the huge amount of civilian casualties and to the massive destruction of property. Now, let's not confuse that with what's going on in Rafah, what went on in Rafah, what's going on in Khan Yunis, and what probably will go on in Gaza City as we go on with this war, which is complete systematic leveling of the entire town. Rafah today is history. Once upon a time, there was a city called Rafah. It doesn't exist anymore. Khan Yunis is about to become history as we speak. Bulldozers systematically take down building after building after building. There is no operational justification, legal sense to this. But this is the policy now. We know it, and we can see it. So this is not harming buildings that have that you can justify, that they serve military purposes or whatever. Systematic leveling down of entire towns.
I want to ask you one last question in the 3 minutes that we have left. Do you think that the 7th of October, in the aftermath of, say, the Egyptians offering their intelligence warning, or at least according to reports and like some of the things that we have discussed, do you have the sense that the 7th of October will be investigated for its security failures?
Again, all this talk about alerts, etc., I wouldn't go there. What is very clear is that Netanyahu doesn't want, or he wants an investigation that will go after the military, the operational aspect of it. He doesn't want an investigation that will look at the big picture. And again, I go here to the big picture in the last 2 minutes we have, because I think that's the most important thing. As we spoke earlier about the different bubbles that bursted in October 7, I would argue the most important bubble that burst was the entire Israeli strategy vis-a-vis Palestinians, which is what, in 3 sentences? Squeezing a growing demography, i.e., the Palestinian population, into a shrinking geography, i.e., the enclaves of Area A and B in the West Bank and one big enclave in Gaza, with the belief that force and technological superiority will allow us permanent domination. That is the bubble that exploded in October 7. Yeah? If there is one thing October 7 taught us, is that the security, the sustainability of Jewish self-determination in our land is interlinked and intertwined with achieving Palestinian self-determination. The idea that we would live while stepping over the throats of millions of Palestinians forever and achieve security this way is not going to work.
Yehuda Shaul, thank you very, very much for your time. And I hope to be able to bother you again for another conversation in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much.